Hello. Today we're going to be talking about suicide. This may be one of the most important discussions we'll have during the entire semester because what you learn about suicide may save your life or someone else's life one day. If you have ever lost someone to suicide, you know how tragic it is for those left behind. The harsh reality is that if someone wants to kill themselves badly enough, they may eventually figure out a way to do it. But there are many things we can do to try to help decrease the risk of that happening and to help individuals who are suicidal to reach a non-suicidal state of mind and a better place in their lives. So this is what our chapter in Comer's text on suicide is really all about. So one of the things that you'll be learning about as you study suicide is the work of Edwin Shneidman, a well-known suicidologist, a researcher in the field of suicide. He's referenced several times in our chapter, and I wanted to talk about a few of his ideas with you today. First of all, you may be aware that Shneidman has identified 4 different kinds of people who intentionally end their lives. His is an interesting way of characterizing suicide. He talks about how people who commit suicide may be death seekers, death initiators, death ignorers, and death darers. So let's talk about each one of these a little bit. As you may be aware, a death seeker is someone who actively makes a plan to take his or her own life. A good example of a death seeker would be someone I knew once, a young woman with a child who was a single mother, and she had experienced a couple of significant losses in her life. She rented a motel room and took whiskey and pills in there with her, and she took a huge overdose and drank a bunch of whiskey in an effort to take her life. Fortunately, before she completely passed out, she did call 911 and she survived. Death initiators are individuals who are trying to hasten the death process but are already nearing death. This might be someone who found out that they have terminal cancer and they don't have a lot longer to live. They may be in pain and afraid of dying, so they just hasten the process along by taking their life as a way to end things. The category of death ignorers is an interesting category because here we see individuals who do not believe that death is final. I suppose you could say from a Christian point of view, those of us who are Christian appreciate that part of what we hope for as Christians is eternal life. But what we're talking about here is someone who ends their life in order to go and be with the individual who has died. Let's say, for example, that a child loses a parent, and then that child commits suicide so they can join their parent. That would be an example of a death ignorer. And then death dares are individuals who uh, defy death. A good example of that would be someone who uh, puts a bullet in a revolver, spins it around, and then pulls the trigger with a gun pointed at their head. What some people might call playing Russian roulette. So the person is daring death, doing dangerous things that could very easily result in loss of life in that particular situation. As you are probably aware, many more people attempt suicide than succeed at it. And the number of suicides in our country is approximately 11 to 12 per 100,000. That's completed suicides. But many more people actually attempt suicide than succeed at it. So Sneidman writes about suicide. He reminds us that it is a self-inflicted, intentional death where someone makes a conscious effort to end their life. So how is suicide studied? There are really two different approaches that tend to be taken to studying suicide. One of these is to do a psychological autopsy on someone who has actually died, to go back and try to piece together their life in a way that can help us to better understand what might cause someone to end their life. And the other approach is to study survivors of suicide attempts in an effort to better understand factors that gave rise to their suicide attempt and factors that are important in their recovery following a suicide attempt. One observation that Sneidman makes about suicide is that probably the greatest, most concerning predictor of suicide is hopelessness. When someone is in a suicidal state of mind, which is a temporary state of mind, they really don't see any other way out than to end their life. Because of that, Sneidman is quoted as saying that the word only is the four-letter word in suicide, meaning that the individual who is suicidal sees suicide as their only option. So another way of putting it is that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary state of mind. It's so important that we can keep this fact in focus as we're considering suicide. Because what's so scary is that when someone is suicidal, they may follow through with it and end their life, and of course, once they've done that, there is no more. If they were able to appreciate that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary state of mind, that could eventually help them to have hope and to realize that they are not always going to be thinking and feeling this way, and that they can hopefully get to a better place. But when a person is suicidal, they're often blocked from being able to see beyond the darkness that would lead to suicide. So our challenge would be to help that person to have the time and the opportunity to achieve a non-suicidal state of mind so they can have hope once again and help themselves to get to a better place. Sneidman has another term that he uses called psych-ache, P-S-Y-C-H-A-C-H-E, for the deep level of pain, emotional pain, that individuals experience when they are in a suicidal state of mind. Something that you may have picked up already in your reading on suicide is there are age and ethnic differences in suicide, and I wanted to explore those with you a little bit today. As you may be aware, starting with adolescence, going into adulthood, girls and women are more likely to attempt suicide, but boys and men are more likely to succeed at suicide. When we're looking at children, pre-adolescent, we don't tend to see those same differences. In fact, boys are at greater risk in that age group of both attempting and succeeding at suicide, but it changes when we get to adolescence and adulthood. Think for a moment about why that might be. That females are more likely to attempt suicide than males are more likely to succeed at suicide. Of course, sometimes males attempt and don't succeed, and sometimes females do succeed. But generally speaking, females are more likely to attempt, and males are more likely to succeed. And as you're probably well aware, one of the reasons for this difference is that men and boys use more lethal methods of suicide, especially guns and hanging. When we think of the influence of age on suicide, that data also is very interesting to consider, because as we get older, moving into middle and then adulthood and late adulthood, for Caucasian Americans, there tends to be a general increase in suicide risk with age, but it's much greater for men than for women. And men, white men who are elderly, are at the highest risk category of suicide of any group. Also, you see an increase around adolescence in suicide as well. In the African American community, the overall risk of suicide is less than in the Caucasian community. You see a bit of a bump upward in adolescence and an increase throughout adulthood, more so in late adulthood, and more so in men than in women, but lower for both African American men and women than Caucasian men and women. So you might think about some possible explanations for that finding, with African American women being the lowest risk group of those that we've just compared. Another interesting group to consider is Native Americans. Overall, Native Americans have the highest suicide rate as a group. But among the elderly, they have the lowest suicide rate. Why do you suppose that would be? Many researchers believe the reason is because in the Native American community, elderly adults are held in high esteem. They are respected and valued for their age and their wisdom, and are less likely to be marginalized as they might be in other segments of American culture. Another interesting model of suicide is that developed by Emil Durkheim, who was a sociologist studying um, societies in Europe in the early 20th century, late 1800s, the 19th century, early 20th century. And he observed that suicide rates seemed to increase during times of social upheaval and disintegration. And he identified three kinds of suicide: egoistic, altruistic, and anomic. You'll read about these three kinds of suicide in our chapter, but individuals who would be considered egoistic suicide risks are those who never have really become integrated into society. They're on the fringes of society, apart from, never a part of society. Altruistic suicides occur when someone sacrifices their life for some greater cause, perhaps to save other people. We learn of a mother who was at risk for dying if she gave birth to her child, but she did so anyway. She died and her child lives. A soldier who might throw himself on a grenade to save his comrades in war. That would be an example of an altruistic suicide, where someone is dying for a greater cause. One area of controversy regarding altruistic suicide is to consider, would a suicide bomber also be someone who's committing altruistic suicide? Is that person dying for a greater cause? There's an interesting discussion about that possibility in your textbook for you to consider. And then those who are in the anomic, A-N-O-M-I-C, suicide category, according to Durkheim, individuals who have, in a sense, fallen through the cracks in society. They are individuals in need of support and services, but they're not getting them. And suicide may be a tragic result. In our modern American society, we might think about people who are chronically mentally ill, perhaps who are homeless, who need various services in a community and may not be getting them. It may fall between the cracks, so to speak, and that lack of support in combination with other struggles in their life may place them at risk for suicide. So in thinking about factors that might place people at risk for suicide, one way that we can think about them is in terms of possible triggers for suicide. In our textbook, author talks about several different triggers that might be associated with suicide. One is stressful events and situations. This can include both more chronic stressful conditions and also major tumultuous, sudden traumatic occurrences that may happen in a person's life. Mood and thought changes also can serve as triggers for suicide. We've already talked a bit about hopelessness, the sense of a person not seeing any other way out, and the deep pain that a suicidal person experiences, which Sneidman calls psyche, as related to mood and thought changes. Of course, the mood state of depression is often seen in individuals who are suicidal. There is a relationship between alcohol and drug use and suicide risk as well. In fact, often when people attempt and succeed at suicide, alcohol or other drugs are involved. A person does not have to have a mental disorder to be suicidal, but suicide is associated with various disorders. The most obvious, of course, would be mood disorder, both major depressive disorder or persistent depressive disorder, unipolar depression, that is, those two types of unipolar depression, and bipolar depression as well, are all associated with increased risk of suicide. Suicide can also be associated with various other disorders. Two that come to mind that we might mention are borderline personality disorder, which we'll be studying about later in the semester, where these individuals are at increased risk for suicidal actions, and eating disorders, especially anorexia nervosa, which has the highest mortality rate of all psychological disorders, in part because of suicide and also in part because of physiological changes that occur in the body associated with starvation that can cause problems like heart attacks. Another factor that can trigger a suicide is what's called modeling or the contagion effect. And the idea here is that when one person commits suicide, other people may want to copy their behavior and also attempt suicide. This has been a serious concern, say in high school environments, where one child might attempt to succeed at suicide, followed by other attempts or successful suicides. So that gives us a bit of an overview of the scope of suicide and some ideas about factors that might trigger suicide. So let's talk a little bit about ways in which we might be able to help somebody who is suicidal. The two approaches that I'd like to mention to you involve, first of all, doing therapy with someone who has attempted suicide but survived. These individuals can be very rewarding to work with, but of course it's also scary because you and the client are living with the possibility that they could become suicidal again. So helping them to get to a non-suicidal state of mind and helping them from the very beginning, hopefully to make a strong commitment to stay alive and to work with you on helping themselves if they start feeling suicidal again, are very important objectives to have in the therapy with individuals who are suicidal. I once knew an adolescent girl who was referred to me by her treating psychiatrist, who worked with her while she was in the hospital, psychiatric hospital, following a suicide attempt. Fortunately, she survived. She had no lasting physical damage from her suicide attempt, which was a drug overdose. And then I got to work with her as a part of her outpatient therapy. She was a delightful teenage girl who was so full of life, vibrant, and had so much to live for. But because of the struggles that were going on in her life at the time, she became suicidal and tried to end her life. After we'd been working together for a couple of months, she came into her session one day and said, "I'm so glad I did not succeed at killing myself because my life is so much better now." and I'm enjoying my life more now than ever before. And then the next thing she said to me really floored me, that a teenager could show so much wisdom. She said, the next time I go through a difficult time, I want to remember, I hope I can remember that it's temporary and that things will eventually change. This is such an important idea for people who have attempted suicide to embrace, that when we go through struggles in our lives, they are always temporary. Things always change. Maybe not exactly in the way we hope they will, but they change. And they can eventually get better. And when we can realize that, it helps us to have hope, not to be hopeless. And to hang in there and be patient with ourselves and our circumstances, to be willing to ask for help and to help ourselves get to a better place. This is a critical aspect of therapy to help individuals to come to understand this reality of life. Another approach to suicide is to help to try to prevent it. And throughout the country, there are suicide hotlines in communities and national. There's a national suicide hotline number. I believe that's in your textbook. And these suicide hotlines are often staffed by paraprofessionals, that is, people from all walks of life, who receive specialized training to answer the phones, and they have professional backup to help them in their work. Our textbook provides you with a description of the steps that one might go through in trying to help a client who calls into such a center, including things like establishing a connection with them, finding out what sort of support they have around them, getting a sense of the urgency and level of risk of the danger of suicide. Do they have a specific method? Is it legal? Is it readily available? As far as support is concerned, finding out do they have someone with them right now who can be there for them and support them and help them get through it, and finding other resources that they can turn to for help and helping them come up with a plan, and then follow up with them and make sure they've carried out that plan. I hope you'll enjoy reading about this approach that's taken by suicide prevention centers in your chapter. I would also like to say a few things in closing about how we can help other people in our lives if we are concerned that they might be suicidal. When you watch the video about the Golden Gate Bridge and the suicides that have resulted from people jumping off of that bridge as a part of this week's module, it is a powerful video that really underscores what the speaker in the video says about the importance of listening, being present and listening with someone who might be suicidal. I can't really emphasize that enough, how important that is. There is a misconception that if we ask the question, are you considering taking your life, that we're giving the person the idea and they'll be more likely to do it. That doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, if anything, it might be a source of relief for the person that someone's finally asked them about it so that they can talk about it. If someone were in an accident and they were lying on the ground and they were bleeding, we would know that their life was at risk and we would take immediate, serious action to save their life. Suicide is no less serious or immediate, yet we cannot physically see the suffering, and we may not act as immediately and take it as seriously as is required in the situation. So it's always important that we can take it seriously and that we can help the person to get the help they need so they can stay safe and hopefully get to a non-suicidal state of mind. Sometimes we may feel conflicted about whether or not to reveal to another person something someone told to us privately about being suicidal. In fact, they might even say, I'm going to tell you something, but you can't tell anybody. Would you tell somebody, or would you keep it to yourself? I believe that it's important in a situation like that that we're able to tell somebody, whether the person wants us to or not, who might be in a position to help keep this person safe and help them get the help that they need. People can get over being angry with us, but they cannot get over being dead. So I hope you're reading on suicide this week, and the video that you have the opportunity to view on suicide will be informative and eye-opening for you and help you to be more knowledgeable about the problem of suicide and about ways in which we can help individuals who are suicidal. Talk with you again soon. Bye.